must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Huh? What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No collusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Welcome to the Antedote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
Well, that is definitely the fitting intro for today, as we have once again approached the anniversary of the events of September 11th. We are now entering 19 years, and I got to say, I followed a little bit of the events of the day. I saw a little bit of this ceremony this morning, and then I saw a couple of things I'm going to get into a little get into as we go on in this conversation that I think really cast even, I would say in some ways, it's somewhat of an even darker light than usual compared to even most September 11th anniversaries. I mean, most years it just comes and goes. Those years in the Bush administration were really bad. And then, obviously a 10th anniversary. But I mean, this year I saw a couple of things that were really, I would say are pretty ominous, considering the combination of the varying narratives you're hearing about Donald Trump being this great anti-war president or everything else that's just going on, like in this particular time and climate and environment we're in, as explosive as everything is right now. And so,
yeah,
19 years to the day, and it's and there's a lot. I have a lot on my mind, and I'm sure you do too, Jeremy. Do you have any just brief, basic thoughts to start out the conversation? Just like what you're feeling on this day.
I think that today there was maybe some years it feels very dark. This year actually sort of felt very heavy, I think, was the energy that I was sensing and also looking at what I was looking at today. And, definitely almost 20 years after the fact, and in certain ways, it feels like we are in more of a challenging position than ever in certain ways, the whole landscape. And so my discipline and energy around outreach and activism and information sharing and even analysis in terms of the kind of work that we do here, it comes and goes over the years. And so I just got to give thanks for people like the Chris Roulons on Twitter, who basically, through all kinds of personal struggles, just continue to lay out the hard facts over the days and the weeks and the years. And so I
also
always
unwavering, very, very unwavering principles, which we don't have nearly enough of as well, I would say as well. Yes,
that's true too, and I think that you're right though in terms of the marking of the day and what the things that you pointed to, obviously the geopolitics of the moment and the uncloaking of the, it's so interesting this is Israeli Arab uncloaking right now is very much obviously about the payload of the 11/9 operation, and none of that just came recently. And very interesting that Trump is now being floated for the Nobel Prize, just as Jerome Corsi, reporting directly live on air on InfoWars back in, what was that, end of 2016, 2017, probably.
I think right in the immediate period after the inauguration, I think is when that happened.
Yeah, you're right. That would have been a little too audacious to have announced that. They didn't even do that for Obama, I don't think, did they? Maybe they did announce.
Well, he won it in his first year, but yeah. I don't know. I mean, I imagine there were some people portraying Obama as the world peace president immediately. So
it's interesting. So that payload has also been uncloaked and delivered at the same time, surrounding this other alleged development of the Israeli UAE diplomatic quote-unquote peace deal, and now Bahrain added on top of that. Bahrain, key player in the region, all the way even back to probably the key Arab geolocation for things like staging of false flags. Go back to even during the George W. Bush administration and the escalation of the chatter for things like mass false flags. You think back to the missing nukes out of the Minot Air Force Base in South Dakota, one of the Dakotas,
North Dakota.
North Dakota, and that had its geolocation in the Middle East in Bahrain. People like Gwyneth Todd were basically, whistleblowers who probably helped stop really massive escalations during those end years of the George W. Bush administration. And so this uncloaking right now is a package deal that is not only the delivery of the global collusion, where the Middle East is this missing piece and Israel as the anchor point, but then also their partners, Saudis, UAE, obviously Bahrain, Egypt, part of that. But then as the anchor point to Russia and the Trump administration. But in many ways, as we've been tracing out in terms of the Trump years, there's also the delivery of the 9/11 wake and promises. And, we of course, heard that even from people like Dennis Ross at the library when he was even in, 2016, at the same time as he was writing these articles in the press about how Obama was basically at the time being too weak, too nonviolent, not enough sort of bloodletting was what Ross seemed to be saying to tell both the Persians and the Russians. It was sort of racial, almost nativistic in a certain way, that he meant business. And then at the library in Kansas City in May 9th, 2016, it was one of the things that Ross dropped on the audience too, was that some of his friends call Israel the first Jewish Sunni state or something like that, and how there was this underlying unfreezing of the relationship there. So yeah, and so this uncloaking of the Nobel Peace Prize as somehow a result of this fake peace agreement that's just being uncloaked right now was exactly what Jerome Corsi was also promising from levels above Israeli intelligence to Alex Jones live on InfoWars airwaves, that Israeli intelligence was going to be pushing for Trump, was going to nominate Trump for Nobel Peace Prize, and they did in the form of the what's known as the Geert Wilders of, I believe, of Norway. Yeah. And you go look in the background of the guy who nominated Trump, and yeah, he's in some kind of Israeli asset partisan of some sort, very, very, very obviously. And so this 9/11 is the uncloaking of the pseudo big reveal.
Yeah. So anyway, and I agree with you. And the events you referred to, by the way, the men I was referring to that kind of put a bit of a dark kind of mood for me on this day was the September 11th, the anniversary, and maybe this was magnified by seeing Ari Fleischer on Fox News this morning. Oof. I don't know, maybe for a whole. I think he was on I think he was the guest panelist on that Outnumbered show where they have 4 women and 1 male on the show, and he was the guy on there, and he was touting the great Trump peace deals, and along with the insanity and craziness of the left, and so, but maybe that casts an extra shadow on it. But it was this combination of what you mentioned today, the announcement of the adding of Bahrain to this quote peace deal between Israel and the UAE, and even having a ceremony like that at the White House on the day of September 11th with Trump and Pence and Jared Kushner and Steve Mnuchin, all wow. They're all standing around Trump as Trump is basically overseeing this and signing this into and speaking about how great this is going to be. And then Trump's deputy press secretary comes on and says that this is going to be, and take note of this, some of you anti-war people, some of you anti-war people who are very critical of Israel, you even do have people from a very pro-Israel perspective speaking of Trump as the anti-war president. This deputy press secretary today, I forget his name, was speaking on Fox News about how basically Trump continuing to cement our relationship with our, quote, greatest ally is an example of Trump bringing the end to the endless wars. It was similar language as what we heard Ron Dermer, the Israel's ambassador to the U.S. on Breitbart Radio a few weeks ago, talking about how all of these great moves, all these great, quote, peace deals are going to result in, Americans not having to fight in these endless wars anymore. And so, and it might be right about that, but ultimately, as we've laid out with what we've talked about with the 2016, collusion and what's going on a geopolitical scale right now, that is not this, even something like that, if it were technically true, is not, if what we foresee coming out of this is not going to be of a great result or consequence for even us here in the States. But even then, though, still, even coming out of what I saw in this then also with this conference, combined with the ceremony of Trump giving the Medal of Honor to these to people who had been over in the Middle East fighting against ISIS, etc. You just see the veneer of what we've discussed, where this is the worst elements of both, the most hardcore elements, domestic elements of both the support for the country that I think we have very strong evidence as far as Israel with Israeli operatives, Mossad operatives, very domestic Israel partisans here in the States being in very, very important positions in New York and D.C. Pentagon with the case of somebody like Dav Zakheim, as well as obviously within the business community, New York Port Authority, for example, the Silversteins. You have strong evidence. Go ahead.
Or even Ari Fleischer, which I can understand the presence of Ari Fleischer on television on September 11th, why that could add a very dark, sheen to your September 11th. I even, just pulled up the article by Christopher Bolin titled "Ari Fleischer and 9/11: Israel's Point Man in the White House," and it's very telling actually because it shows the day of Bush at the phone in the elementary school classroom down there in Florida. And let me just read just a tiny bit of this. Quote, "The reason why George Bush accepted the Israeli interpretation of 9/11, and it's referring back to Ehud Barak, veteran of, prime minister, head of Israeli military intelligence, a commander of Sayeret Matkal, actually Netanyahu's commander at some point, I believe, talking about being that he's the first guy who articulates on television the narrative, the post-9/11 narrative, the war on terror narrative. So, okay, quote, "The reason why George Bush accepted the Israeli interpretation of 9/11 is because his spokesman was Lawrence Ari Fleischer, who had very close ties to Israel. Not only was Fleischer a dedicated Zionist, his older brother was the president of an Israeli-owned company, owned and controlled by Israeli Air Force veterans, one of whom was a business partner in a company with Ehud Barak. So, by simply talking with his brother on the phone, Ari Fleischer would be in contact with an Israeli network based in New Jersey that included Ehud Barak. The following photographs and captions explain the relationship between Ari Fleischer in the White House and Ehud Barak, a prime suspect of being a master planner of the 9/11 atrocity." And so then it has that first photo of Bush at the elementary school table, and there's Fleischer sort of eagerly fixated with his attention on Bush as Bush is writing something down, maybe a speech or his remarks that he's going to speak to the world out there at the elementary school. It says September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush was visiting the Emma E. Brooker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida, when news of the attack on the World Trade Center broke. While still at the school, Bush and his press secretary, Ari Fleischer, began preparing the president's address to the nation. But how at that early stage did they know what to say? And then there's a next one where you see Bush has a furrowed brow. It looks like they're on Air Force One, potentially. Maybe they're just in an office somewhere. I can't tell. Maybe they're just in an office. But George W. Bush has the phone up to his ear and a very furrowed brow. And then there's Ari Fleischer right behind him with the yellow pad, sort of with his hand on his hip, looking really, really calm. And the quote is, "Fleischer seems oddly calm in spite of the terror atrocity as he helped the president craft his comments to the nation." How did Fleischer know what the president should say when virtually nothing was known about who was behind the crime? Bush seems concerned and troubled, but not Fleischer. And then there's a picture of Bush in the Oval Office at the desk. Quote, at 8:30 p.m., the president addressed the nation, and it's also showing the computer screen that has his words that are being probably scrolled on his teleprompter. At 8:30 p.m., the president addressed the nation from the White House. In his speech, he set the tone for the wars to come in Afghanistan and Iraq. And by the way, Greg, in terms of what you were referring to in the, in terms of Trump being marketed by all of this whole network as the anti-war guy, it's even someone like Justin Amash, a former Republican at this point, points out that it's all just smoke and mirrors, just like basically every other thing that is trumpeted about Trump. It's just a sort of TV show, and a deceptive TV show at that.
It's interesting, real quick, it's interesting that a former Republican, libertarian-leaning Republican congressman is much more vocal about what appear, Trump's actual lack of anti-war credentials or principles than even like the people who we've been led to believe are like these great heroes of like anti-war, anti-imperialist rhetoric, the Glenn Greenwalds of the world, or I would even point to the Ron Pauls of the world. Ron Paul does sometimes he'll be critical of various foreign policy endeavors under Trump, but, not nearly to the level somebody like that should be. And of course, his son is basically a bootlicker for Trump, Rand Paul, but claiming that at the Republican National Convention to a national audience that Trump is the anti-war president. So it is interesting that you have an ex-Republican, libertarian-minded congressman who has gone independent, who is saying what people, a lot of very credentialed, quote, anti-war people are not saying.
It's true. I mean, and Amash points out basically that just if you do the numbers, that Trump has basically he's at higher levels in terms of U.S. troop numbers in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I believe that's what he says as when he came in. Okay, that he basically raised the numbers, and now he's brought them down almost to basically to the level of when he entered office. And how is that true to what's being said about what Trump is?
Oh, and let's compare that to another person we might talk about a little later in this stream, Tucker Carlson, who his whole idea of Trump is anti-war, basically very much fitting into a Russian horseshoe of Trump got us out of Syria, and he on one hand we got out of Syria, and is basically what their thing, like the idea of Trump being the anti-war president, is what Trump stopped something in Syria, and fear-mongering about what a Biden-Harris administration is going to do. It's basically Clinton all over again, where you have these ominous promises that they're going to get us into a literal war in Syria. And I don't know if I've seen any strong evidence pointing to that, but I mean, that's what you've got going with it, like this combination of, Trump, this, and this is the anti-war president. I don't think it really matches up to the facts, combined with a lot of talk about projection of what the other side, the real warmongers are going to do if they get elected. And of course, that just runs in complete contrast to everything else you hear on Fox, from the Ari Fleischers to the Sean Hannitys to the whoever else's. But
so true. Okay, and there's a bunch more photos here. The next photo, first there's the photo of Bush basically declaring the post 9/11 era. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. Then it's Ari Fleischer with his I don't know if it's called, I think, tefillin. He says it has his tefillin on, and the black cube on his forehead, hanging out with his Chabad
probably very symbolic
fellows.
When you think about it, for sure, that day. I would imagine a lot of symbolism in that.
Yeah, and this is a month later and it looks like it might be at the Rose Bowl with Chabad Pasadena, actually, and it references the supremacism and the Jewish racism embedded within Chabad doctrine specifically, and refers to a bunch of quotes from the Rebbe Schneerson quoted in Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel by Israel Shahak and Norton Mezvinsky, and then shows Fleischer as the White House spokesman, sort of using the sort of the devil horn hand sign while he's at the White House as the press secretary. Then there's a picture of his brother, the president, Michael Paul Fleischer, the president of the Israeli-owned Bogan Communication International from Ramsey, New Jersey. Very digital voice processing systems. Bogan's new boss, the Israeli Air Force veteran Yoav Stern. Okay, so there's a whole bunch here, and so maybe we should move on. But people can go look at this article. A lot of interesting information here to see the background of who was at Bush's right hand, and then the one who was articulating and helping write the words for the President of the United States on September 11th in the immediate wake. Ari Fleischer, 9/11, Israel's point man in the White House.
I'm glad you're filling this information in because, even I like knowing what Ari Fleischer represents in one form or another. Like, until you just laid it out and articulated it the way you did, like, I didn't realize just how significant, he was specifically right there in the inner circle, being right there in Florida and basically being the person monitoring and likely managing, Bush's direct response as the person in the administration. Well, there was one other one, in addition to I think his chief of staff was there as well, Andy Card. But really Fleischer being the guy, like the point man on the ground with Bush, who was, I'm sure ended up traveling with him to wherever he went, made his speech, the little stop in Omaha before that too, I believe. That was
Right. They were going to the different Air Force bases. Yeah. Well, because remember, one of the reasons why he was flying all around partially was because there was this articulated threat. Angel is next, right? Angel being the code word for Air Force One. And so it's those kinds of facts about September 11th that point to it being much more complicated than saying, oh, it was an inside job or these whole memes, Bush did it. No, it looks much more that Bush was at some way being a sort of targeted at some level while also being guided and being part of the post 9/11 policy. And we've talked a lot about the sort of more the extent of the post 9/11 policy being guided by the figure of the fake dissident.
Oh, and Natan Sharansky. Yes, I was just about to mention that Sharansky, and that would be in a way like an ego kind of stroking for Bush, like taking advantage of. I don't know exactly. The Bush family isn't the most principled family in the world, but perhaps at some level, I don't know if Bush actually had any real feelings about things like, whatever was attributed to him by like some of the liberal writers, Gog and Magog or whatever. But very clearly there was a stroking of like an ego, like with the, bringing in like a role of somebody like a Sharansky to bring in with Bush to sell this idea of a war on democracy and like you're the guy who's like going to do these great things. So I could see that at play in post 9/11. I brought that up since you mentioned Sharansky. So. Well,
thank you for bringing that up because the thing about the Angel is next and Bush on Air Force One, supposedly the leader of the free world, the most powerful man in the world, sort of flying around the country when the DC has been hit, the Pentagon's been hit, the World Trade Center is either burning or been sort of blown into smithereens on live television with living human beings inside of them. And the president is just sort of flying around the country. Meanwhile, Dick Cheney is in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, dug in, and supposedly Bush is being told not to come to D.C., right, for security reasons, to sort of diversify the chain of command and the succession of power and all of that. But meanwhile, the main thing that is pointed to by this Angel is next is that the network that did September 11th not only was threatening the president at some level, was threatening his network, but it also meant it's a hint at the aspect of the inside job that there was a cyber dimension to it, right? And that is critical, I think, to understanding both how it was done. Sure, the big sort of Hollywood aspect, of course, is the the planes, the hijackings, the buildings being blown up, and things on fire and all of that. But really deep under the hood is a cyber operation, and looking into, like, for example, who we've mentioned before, Amit Yaron, working as the cyber czar inside of the Pentagon, the systems admin, the God mode administrator inside the Pentagon, basically remodeling the Pentagon cyber infrastructure in the run-up to September 11th. It has the feel of something like Amdocs being wired into the White House during the Clinton years, also in the years, in the run-up to the big wedding, as it was called, right? So there's that, and then just as we got on to Sharansky, it's very interesting. We should delve back into this just a tiny bit. Is this book by Barry Chamish, who passed away maybe a couple years ago, called "Bye Bye Gaza" by Barry Chamish, I'm going to read from page 64. Okay, this is an interview between Barry Chamish and a guy named Yuri Nudelman, I think. Okay, so okay, here you go. Page 62. Barry Chamish. Oh no, Okay, Yuri Nudelman, page 62. In 1962, the KGB initiated a program of dissidents against the Soviet Union. By running the dissident groups, it could control the various factions which were dissatisfied with Soviet repression and later utilize the leaders as agents in the West. They were known as spies of influence. By appearing to be anti-Soviet, they were welcomed abroad and trusted. They could worm themselves into the top echelons of foreign governments. Sharansky was one of these agents, and possibly the most successful. Barry Chamish. But wasn't he a Zionist leader in the Soviet Union? Didn't he spend 8 years in prison for his activities? Yuri Nudelman. He was never a leader. He was unknown to most of us until the Western media turned him into a hero. He supposedly spent 7 years in jail and 1 year in a prison camp. No one saw him in jail except Mendelovich, and he claims he only saw his eyes through a peephole. Understand this, there is not one witness to him sitting in jail. He spent a year in a prison camp as a hut commander. That was the position given to KGB informers. But what about his wife Avital, who fought for his freedom in Israel, Barry Chamish asks. Yuri Nudelman, all a KGB show, like her supposed conversion to Judaism in 1974. She is from a family of spies. Her brother Michael was sent to Washington to infiltrate the CIA. He got into trouble there and fled to Israel. Not long after he arrived, he was poisoned to death at age 44. That's an interesting aside that the brother, Sharansky's wife's brother, was a military attaché, actually, I think, from Israel, I think. But he was, Nudelman is saying that he was a Soviet mole. Okay, Barry Chamish. What was the point of this charade surrounding Sharansky? Nudelman. He infiltrated Israel as a worldwide hero. Remember, he got there through a spy exchange, not simply released from prison and allowed to leave like all the rest of us. Within a few years, he was living in a $1.5 million home. Where did he get that kind of money? On the side, if you go check, Red Mafia by Robert Friedman, he tells you where he got the money. He got the money from the Red Mafia, from I believe it was Luchansky, I think is the name of the Jewish Russian mobster who funded Sharansky, and even Netanyahu, I think. And I think there was the U.S. State Department was warning them about accepting this mobster money. And
funny how you never hear these names mentioned when you hear all about like the looting of Russia post fall of the Soviet Union. No,
you do not. Okay, so then Nudelman says, Next, he was in the government cabinet. Now he's really useful. When the powers that run America want Netanyahu to withdraw from Judea and Samaria, who do they send to the Y plantation? Their agents Sharon and Sharansky. So this is interesting. So this is from and this is similar to Chamish, the Noodleman. They're actually more, they're sort of more militant about Jewish land. It sounds like. Then they're accusing the Sharons and the Netanyahus of being, which is an interesting perspective to hear here. Yeah. So their agents Sharon and Sharansky, when the same powers seek a justification for attacking Afghanistan and Iraq, who do they turn to but the trusted Sharansky, right? Which is how his name came up here in the first place. He's the guy who gave George W. Bush the justification about the idea of how democracy building is basically concomitant with national security. That was the whole thesis, right? And this is interesting too, because this is what you heard the neoconservatives saying at the exact same time. Even what we might call the paleo neoconservatives, like the Crystals and the Kagans, they're basically saying that quote unquote democracy, we can meet our values to our interests, right? So that's the exact same kind of thing. And so that's what the role that Sharansky played. And then, of course, in the next stage after that, Sharansky is the point man on defining the new anti-Semitism, the weaponized and authoritarian, really, definitions of using anti-Semitism as a proxy to control core political speech globally. Really, that's what it's mainly about, while also continuing to further, utilize the Semite, anti-Semite sort of controlled horseshoe, controlled opposition dialectic, and further inflaming that at this very same time. Okay, let me just finish up a little bit more here, Greg, and then I'll pass it back to you.
Go for it.
Okay, so Bye Bye Gaza by Barry Shamish. We're on page 63. Okay, so when the same powers seek this is Yuri Noodleman. When the same powers seek a justification for attacking Afghanistan and Iraq, who do they turn to but the trusted Sharansky? Just last week, Condoleezza Rice called Sharansky the father of the movement to turn the Middle East democratic. When Putin is condemned worldwide for the slaughter in Chechnya, who comes to his rescue but Sharansky? Incidentally, that turned out to be a big mistake for Sharansky. Chamish, why? Noodleman, because after my book was published, he called in his chips. He asked Putin to release his whole KGB file to him so no one could ever see it. Then he released on the internet the parts of the file he thought would serve him best. He chose the wrong files to release because they revealed what we all knew. During his interrogation and trial in 1977 to 78, Sharansky gave the KGB a long list of Jewish activists. It was during his trial that the witch hunt against us began in earnest. Dozens of Jewish activists were arrested, some beaten severely. Sharansky was nothing but a dirty little snitch. These are serious allegations. I think this is back to Chamish. These are serious allegations. Now we look at the evidence, much of which comes from the protocols of Noodleman's trial, which stands out. What stands out is that a who's who of former Soviet Jewish activists testified on Noodleman's behalf, whereas not one witness except his wife testified for Sharansky. He could find not even one witness who knew him from prison and who saw his bravery in action. And then it goes further into all of this. And we can touch back onto this in the future, too. I just think there's so much here. And the fact that this is not known at all in either the Jewish community, let alone like the general Western political community.
Yeah, it's so true. And I was wondering when you were talking about that, it basically sounds like Sharansky at least was being accused of, at the very least, of basically, throwing other, basically selling out other, other Soviet Jews to to the powers that be. Basically, he was acting as an agent to basically throw other Jewish dissidents to the wolves, or the real dissidents, I guess you could say, to the wolves, while he's operating on behalf of the enemy. I would wonder, will we ever hear the likes of Dr. Steve Pieczenik bring this up? Sharansky, act similar vein to how George Soros allegedly collaborating with the Nazis is always brought up. I have my doubts, but
yeah, me too.
But this is so interesting about Sharansky. Even people like in this very, unfortunately, in this, anti-Zionist community, a lot of which very serious anti-Zionist researchers, activists, tend to be, unfortunately, in this very, I would say, very Russia-centric sphere, either knowingly or unknowingly, very, very, very Russian-centric, very, very Russian-friendly, and you don't hear so much of this information about someone like Sharansky, this deep information. As I mentioned, he's never discussed or mentioned in terms of like the post-Cold War era Russia, where you hear about the wide-scale looting and other events on a global scale that were done to the Russian economy. And so you never hear about Sharansky relations. This is stuff that is very, very, this is... you have to look really to find this information, and sometimes you stumble upon it by accident. But I was thinking about one more thing with Sharansky in relation to what you laid out there. Sharansky's the guy who comes in basically when comes in during these important talks about giving up territory. He's also the guy who comes in to sell the war in Iraq as a war for democracy to Bush. And he's the guy to come in to defend Putin, which is very interesting, like the international figure who will defend Putin in the case of Russian aggression. Very interesting, because I was thinking about this from a couple of perspectives. On one hand, we've been trying to lay out what we call this, maybe more of a more multipolar aspect of the September 11th operation, the ongoing war on terror. We've pointed to what we've identified and laid out as our belief that there's a double game going on, perhaps in a place like Syria, where you have the good cop, bad cop with the Americans and the Russians, and kind of the Israelis being in the middle and playing both sides of this good cop, bad cop operation. We've laid that out on previous shows, but in general, more of what we call a multipolar, maybe a more Russian-centric, or even a Chinese-centric, more of an Eastern-centric perspective in terms of even weakening the West, using September 11th and the war on terror and this global the global outrage that comes as a result of it, using that against the United States as far as the Western world in terms of shifting global power from the West to the East, which I think is one of the key tenets of an aspect of what is going on with the Trump operation at a bigger scale. But even something like Sharansky coming into the United States and convincing Bush this is all about a war for democracy, in addition to maybe if you look at Sharansky as a long-term agent of some type of Israeli, Russian, Soviet operation, similar to what we've identified with the nest, the Richard Pearl nest, as we've called it, with people like obviously Pearl, some of the folks who were in the Office for Special Plans, the David Wormsers, Douglas Feitz, people of that nature, as well as Frank Gaffney, the prominent national security commentator in the Trump era. Sharansky could be looked at similarly to that, as the Soviet-Israeli, some type of operative at some level, combination of both of these countries at one level or another, or at least their intelligence services, some aspect or another. A combination of interests being fulfilled in terms of what this particular sphere of influence would look for as far as aspects of the war on terror, but also even selling this war to Bush as, and I'm just laying this out here as a theory, selling the war in Iraq as a war for democracy. And the fact that this false claim of bringing democracy has brought so much rightful, but anger and resentment on a global scale, condemnation towards the United States of America. It's interesting if we look at a horseshoe-style operation, is Sharansky, someone like that, in place to sell this war as a war democracy to someone like Bush as part of a means of actually using the war on terror to destabilize the United States and to turn, even further turn global public opinion against the Americans as being the purveyors of all these wars and conflicts? I don't know, but it's something that I was just thinking about as you were talking there.
Yeah, exactly, because it also seems like it's some kind of massive heresy to even contemplate what is out in the open in terms of geostrategy that the United States, for example, the whole backstory, the limited hangout, the intelligence legend of the background of September 11th is exactly the United States, right? You know, the Brzezinskis, right? To give the Soviet Union their Afghanistan, right, via the Mujahideen, it evolves into Al Qaeda, the blowback of 9/11, but the origins of that, right, is to back the Mujahideen to give the Soviets their Vietnam and Afghanistan. All right, so that's open history now, right? And so everyone's allowed to contemplate that the United States national security planners, geostrategic types, would do something like draw in a rival country into a quagmire in South Central Asia to weaken them, or to in that case to try to precipitate their collapse in many ways. So it shouldn't be at least unthinkable to imagine that the target nation of that operation in terms of Afghanistan might want to do something similar back to the United States. And what do we see after September 11th is the United States intractable war in Afghanistan. Right, and it didn't lead to the collapse of the empire per se, but if we think about this more as you were talking about, the rise of the tension, the rise of the suffering, the rise of the actual blowback of serious political resentment as the result of these illegal aggressive wars based on lies, all of them. Right. Then you'd see, oh, yeah, that's exactly what we saw, really, and sure, you can explain it. And people have continued to try to explain it over and over and over by the geostrategic desires of the American empire to dominate that part of the world, as the way that even someone like Ray McGovern did the acronym of OIL, as we've mentioned before, O for oil. And as we pointed out, even the oil part was really oil for Israel, going back to the Gary Vogler book, The Politics of Oil, talking about the apparent Israeli insertion of a foreign services officer, i.e. 98% of Israeli foreign service officers are intelligence officers, i.e. one Michael Makovsky, over the concerns of the actual Pentagon security types to be at the head of the Pentagon's Iraq oil operations post-Iraq war. Okay, so there's something. So even the O for oil is questionable about whether that's actually oil for the American empire. It's not only not question. I think it's it looks like that's actually a proper hypothesis about what the oil piece of the Iraq war was. Yeah, oil is the Americans. It's only about the Americans. It's pretty much every what you might call Russian horseshoe operative within the anti-war movement, like the Medea Benjamins of the world will constantly tell you. It was more than just about the evil American empire and the oil companies, many of which were actually, many of the Anglo-American oil companies, as we know them, were actually not as gung-ho about going into Iraq. Meanwhile, there were other interests that we've talked about before in relation to Vogler, but you don't hear about those interests from the anti-war, foundation-funded anti-war movement as we know it. Well, even all these characters who, even those types, right, the Medea Benjamins, but even to the sort of alternative media truth people, reject the massive architecture of the Russian component of the 11/9 operation of Trump collusion, that a lot of these characters who are oligarchs, who are then denied by the people like the Aaron Mates as that these are just sort of, some Russians. They're just some Russians, or like Max Blumenthal and the Prigozhin, the Eric Prince of Russia is called a hot dog vendor. And so there's nothing deep state. There's no Russian state in the mixer. These are just sort of random sort of rich guys and odd characters. And then for the alternative sort of truth community, they're basically they're isolated from the actual Russian state, Russian deep state national security apparatus. This happens despite Putin, or Putin just doesn't know about this. the commanding heights of the Russian military intelligence establishment are just sort of caught off guard at some way, similar to sort of like the story about 9/11 and everybody caught off guard allegedly. So it's sort of interesting that all of these characters who are sort of, tried to, by this whole horseshoe, trying to wash it away, they're all involved with energy politics too, right? And so it's all gas lines. It's even the fertilizers is all based on gas supplies and all this kind of stuff. So,
and when your feet are held to the fire about these people, you try to concoct and spin a web that they're actually somehow not advancing Russian interests, but are actually doing anything but and are actually working against Russia. If you're somebody like Paul Manafort, so.
Right. So okay. So the explanation by the Ray McGoverns, right? That this is for the American Empire. Then I represents Israel, right? So there's this Israeli component to it, right? There's an Israeli interest in the war on terror and the location of the bases, and then L is for location or logistics, i.e., to get someone like Eric Prince in the mix. He's just a logistics guy. He's just like, Eric Prince. Max Blumenthal should call Eric Prince. He's just like your local FedEx man. He just delivers
they're too busy
packages.
Running cover for Eric Prince by denying that there's anything of note going on in China with the Uyghur population. So,
yeah, if you want to know what's going on with Eric Prince, and you definitely got to follow, the people who've been really close to him, like the Marine veteran who was his C-suite, comrade at Blackwater, Greg Smith, who is making some moves, it looks like, and pushing hard to get some things out. And so there's a whole background there with someone like Prince that is if there's a singular character, is maybe like Twin Towers of the sort of this generation of the multipolar deep operatives, and it's really sort of suspended between Flynn and Prince, really, right? So Flynn is actually a government guy. He was head of DIA. He's a general. And so then there's Prince, who's he's a contractor. Yes, he was military, but really he's made his name outside of the government by the one who defends all of the senators when they go and look at the Iraq War as a private military contractor. So location and logistics, right? So there is that explanation. Obviously, the militaristic moves of the U.S. Government in the post 9/11 world are serving certain imperial interests. However, you still at least have to be able to contemplate this question of the chaos factor, of the guilt by a bad action, the guilt by association. If you want to look at like Jeff Gates' hypothesis about the Israeli chaos theory warfare component to its relationship with the United States, and how it's very much about a transnational strategies and usages of transnational organized crime. So I think you have to at least contemplate, especially with someone like a Sharansky in the midst of all of this, that there is potentially some it was very obvious at the very least that like people who say it was a mistake. Right, it was the Iraq War was the worst mistake, and we've already talked about multiple times about obviously that's a whitewash of the immorality, the wickedness of the action. But then,
by the way, who calls it a big mistake? Donald Trump.
There you go. There you go. Right,
but only a big mistake in terms of we should have just gone in and stole their oil, and who cares about anything else we do, but we shouldn't have been there forever. We should just gone in and stole the oil and killed a bunch of people in the process. It doesn't matter. But I mean, that's, anyway, well, diet anti-war Trump. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, it is interesting that is the American security public consensus that it was bad news.
Yes.
for the American empire even, right? And so that then suggests, well, all right, if the Afghanistan war was bad news for the Soviet empire, then maybe the Afghanistan war is bad for the American empire, and maybe the Iraq war, maybe there's something deeper going on here. And as we pointed out over and over, just by looking at the text of the clean break doctrine, that there is a at the very least, a multipolar logic to what we're seeing unfold here that goes way beyond just sort of like, oh, John Kerry slipped up at some press conference and then Putin seized the moment about how it was possible to stop Barack Obama from bombing Syria, and the only solution that was mentioned was the thing that would meet exactly what the security planners who were represented in the Clean Break paper in 1996 handed to Netanyahu, where they talk about overthrowing Saddam Hussein in Iraq and rolling back and containing Assad in Syria, the Assads in Syria, right? Then that's basically then what we see, and over and over to this day, no one in the alternative media really explains this, especially in terms of like the anti-war so-called people, like the people who should be explaining this, what's going on. And all they can say is that Russia stopped the United States from overthrowing Assad like the United States wanted to. And it was just, it was just another failure of American policy, rather than the success of this national so-called security group, of the clean break types, where they're obviously not just American security people. They're very Israeli oriented at the very least. And then when you throw in the Pearl Pollard network, it begins to look very much like there is this long-term backdoor or cutout type of operation going on in relationship to the East, and specifically the former Soviet Union. So we have to be able to at least contemplate this. And just one last thing on terms of that point is that, people could say, oh, well, who is this Yuri Nudelman guy who's making these accusations against Natan Sharansky? Why haven't I ever seen anything about this in English? And, this is how, one of the ways which we judge things is by looking at some of these statements and assertions, looking at the potential plausibility of it, whether there's some other facts, maybe contextual or circumstantial facts that might suggest that this could be the case, and then also taking into factor these kinds of serious accusations by serious people being known not at all, which is the sign of, rather than the sign of like the Alex Joneses and the David Ikes being the most censored people on the internet, and yet everybody knows all about their censorship, and their, you can go find their stuff everywhere, and there's always the Barbra Streisand effect in full gear, where it always acts to amplify their reach and their notoriety. Meanwhile, name one person who even knows that this Yuri Nudelman guy made these accusations against the man, the most famous Soviet dissident, at the very least the most famous Jewish Soviet dissident, who is the guy who influenced George W. Bush with his books and all of that in the post 9/11 era. And so you could say, oh, who's this guy? This is just some sort of, Donald Trump. He's just fake news. He just doesn't like me. He was just a coffee boy. He didn't like, he didn't like BB, or something like that. Or he didn't like, But, okay, so here's what it is. Page 61 of Barry Chamish's book, where he introduces how he came to know this. And by the way, Nudelman wrote a whole book, but it's not translated in English. It's only in Russian, I think, and Hebrew, okay? So there's something there, too. Okay, page 61, titled Natan the Liar. Quote, I was contacted by two distinguished Russian Israelis last week, January 2005. Key timing, too, if you think about it in relationship to the evolving Iraq war or devolving Iraq war at the time. First, the respected journalist Effie Majdanek made a pitch to me to investigate the harassment of a, quote, truth seeker like you, unquote, Dr. Yuli Nudelman. Then I was honored with 3 emails from the revered former prisoner of Zion, Ida Nudel. She also wrote, quote, Yuli needs help, unquote. Mrs. Nudel's correspondence will follow this article. Dr. Yuli Nudelman is the former chief surgeon of Rambam Hospital. In the 1960s, he was a leader of the movement to allow Soviet Jews to emigrate to Israel. When the Soviets released him, he quickly made his mark in Israel as a major in the IDF, awarded for his battlefield surgery, then as a crusader against local medical corruption. He was a columnist for the left-wing crusading news magazine Ha'olam Hazeh, and later the author of 2 powerful books exposing serious malpractice in the Israeli medical system. So he's also a domestic whistleblower in terms of his own area of expertise. In 1999, he released a book in Hebrew and Russian called Sharansky Unmasked. Within, he claimed that Natan Sharansky, then housing minister, was a longtime KGB agent with deep ties to the worldwide Russian mafia. Soon after its release.
And you've, I believe the book Red Mafia pretty much validated that.
Yes, right. And so this is one
reason.
Among
other sources.
Well, that's a good point, because that was one of the contextual or circumstantial facts that we were already aware of in terms of our research, that when we ran into this, that it further explained that sort of relationship in a much sort of more plausible and coherent way, actually, because the Red Mafia makes it sort of sound like that Sharansky just sort of shows up in the Soviet Union and then is presented with this money and just sort of takes it out of, because he needs to, or his own greed or something like that. But then this makes the whole thing really, really fit in a similar way, that understanding people like Prigozhin, the so-called hot dog contractor, is actually, a key operative in the Russian deep state, i.e. the intersection between national security and then the cutout operations of the black market and the mob economics and all of that. That, of course, is that's the work of intelligence. It's always cut out so it can be plausibly deniable. And people like Aaron Mate just act like silly in relationship to understanding basic things about how, just like I said, in terms of that it's recognized by U.S. intelligence that 98% of Israeli foreign service officers, i.e. diplomats, i.e. State Department, 98% are intelligence, right? So that's something, I think it's probably exaggerated at some level in Israel, but that's very indicative of the way that it's usually done. That's official cover, is the local embassy. That's where most intelligence officers will sit. It's actually rarer for them to be a non-official cover where they're actually, totally off the books and acting as something totally different. That's where most of the spooks are. And someone like Aaron Mate just had this debate with this New York Times, ended up being a lightweight, and makes you wonder about the New York Times.
Israel was not mentioned once in this whole 1 hour and 20-minute debate.
And calling into question about whether Konstantin Kilimnik is plausibly a Russian intelligence officer because he was acting as he was in the U.S. State Department or in the embassy and doing translations on the Russian side to people like Victoria Nuland, which is exactly the someone who came up in a Russian military intelligence school and then becomes a translator. That's a very plausible, intelligence officer. How many intelligence officers are there that you can actually name who haven't named themselves? They basically aren't. You don't know they're an intelligence officer unless they're very rarely exposed, or if they admit it themselves. So I'm just saying that this is how you begin to sort of put these types of things together. You have the information from Red Mafia, Robert Friedman basically saying, okay, yeah, these new guys in Israel, like a Sharansky, are accepting all of this money from the Red Mafia against the request of the American State Department. And so that basically said, oh, this is an ongoing, deep state operation. Or people like Rybolovlev, the fertilizer king, who basically, it came out last week too, from, I think it was Cohen's book, that Donald Trump thought that Vladimir Putin actually bought the mansion that Trump elbowed Epstein out of the way, and it was very likely, as we've hypothesized, the actual reason for the Trump-Epstein split.
Crickets in the media, by the way.
It's true, and Rybolovlev basically assured that Trump, when he was having a very difficult time finding a buyer, more than doubled his money on that. And Cohen says that whether or not he doesn't know whether Trump actually believed it or whether it was actually true, but Trump told Cohen that he thought that it was Putin who had bought his house. Okay?
Yes.
No, but Trump Russia is just it's a conspiracy theory or whatever, Aaron Monte would call it. It's just stupid.
Yes, it is. And I think we might be going back to that here sooner or later, maybe in the context of this recording or very soon, but in that whole dynamic, because that whole Michael Cohen, what's going on with that needs to really be dissected and evaluated. I think we will get to that. But going back, one more point on Sharansky is that, what I was thinking about with this aspect of destabilization being involved with the war is that look, already, you had a burgeoning this is kind of the unfortunate thing about what we know as anti-establishment, anti-war movements on both the right and the left, whether it's the more, kind of libertarian, paleo-conservative anti-war, and even the very weaponized, like all things America does is all the fault of, the Jewish people, which is what you hear like more in the alt-right circles, whether it's the control, kind of the right-wing anti-war, structure, whether it's the left, which is the more pronounced, more vocal aspect of it. Unfortunately, a lot of these entities do seem to be very, I would say, I hate to say very controlled, and a lot of them you could say fit into like this perhaps a Russian-centric type of propaganda operation as far as operatives and agents entrenched within the anti-war movement, other places. One of the consequences of the war on terror, as we know it, the quote war on terror, falsely named, that's the official name for it, and this was known beforehand with like the wars in Indochina, Vietnam, some of the war crimes that have been committed over the decades. I mean, obviously, it's had much of like a global image of the United States, of the Yankees, as Yankee go home. But the aftermath of September 11th and the obvious nature of the war crimes committed in Afghanistan and Iraq and in fighting these wars that 90% of people in Afghanistan did not know about September 11th, for example, or obviously the crime that was committed upon the Iraqis in mass for the second time in 12 years, in addition to the decade of sanctions that took place prior to September 11th. This really cemented the image of like the Americans, the evil Americans, and what the Americans are doing in the world. And while on one hand, this is obviously validated and it's technically not incorrect, at the same time, though, it is a cause of a destabilization from within in terms of a long-term process of, weakening the U.S., moving this global power structure is destabilization from within. And a big part of that is lack of faith in your institutions and your and everything else related to your institutions, to your rule of law, your government, based on these crimes that are committed on an international and global scale. So I can even look at, by extension, laying out the theory that someone like a Sharansky could be in Bush's ear selling this as a war on democracy to push that narrative of, the evil Americans and their fake democracy is killing all these people around the globe. So just throwing that out there, and I wanted to just finish that thought there regarding...
Crucial, Greg. I mean, this is what is very people do not want to contemplate for lots of different reasons. Partially because of the way that even the sort of the anti-communist or anti-Soviet, especially during the Cold War, rhetoric was weaponized. And that's what we're beginning to try to unpack now, too, is how a lot of that, the horseshoe, that it wasn't just that there were Soviet agents potentially working the angles in the peace movement, in the American peace movement, or in the American civil rights movement, and it didn't undermine the actual organic and moral and patriotic sentiments and reasons behind the majority of the people who were involved in those, really pro-American in the best sense of the word, avenues for core political action. But it was also that they were the hawks. The hawks are under key suspicion here. The people like the people who congregated around the Rand Corporation, like we talked about a few shows back. They were talking about like people who were seen as the arch hawks in many ways, who are highly questionable, whether it's from Kissinger to the Pearls to the Ledines, to all these kinds of characters who are still, their politics are right in the mix. We pointed it out very much about somehow basically no one was willing to actually publicly point out, while there was all these sort of people trying to say that Donald Trump was the anti-war candidate, that his boy, who almost could have been vice president, Michael Flynn, the key guy leading the chant that was really a replication of what Manafort was doing in Ukraine against Yulia Tymoshenko, I think. Lock her up. Lock her up. And they wanted to lock her up not on behalf of because of her alleged corruption. They wanted to lock her up because she was going to be bad. She was bad for business, for the people that Manafort, whose paymasters were, right? The Dmitry Firtashes. So even like the people who have recently come to the Patriot table, like people like Michael Hayden, who's now it's an existential crisis of the Republic with Trump, and he's now using swear words on Twitter to call out basically the treason of Trump. And yet, who is Michael Chertoff still Michael Hayden's paymaster? Because Michael Chertoff is deeply wrapped up with Firtash. Michael Chertoff is deeply wrapped up with Carbon 9/11 alongside Epstein, Israeli military intelligence operative, actual Israeli military intelligence chief Ehud Barak, Latal Lashem, and even known Russian close Putin oligarch Viktor Vekselberg. So when's Michael Hayden going to come out against his paymaster Michael Chertoff's shady-ass background in the midst of all of this?
More hypothesizing here, but it almost seems like at some level, maybe someone like Michael Hayden is thrown out there, at least in part, to lend credence to this idea that everybody who's anybody is just absolutely uncritically, unquestionably opposed to Trump because they're trying to destroy the little guy who's standing against them, when in reality, at the very least, as you mentioned, Hayden's paymaster, if not Hayden himself, I'm not sure, are very much in this whole circle and network of what's actually going on with Trump. So
that's a good question here. So that's, Manafort, right? Manafort, the background of Manafort there, talking about lock her up, right? So Michael Flynn, right in the mix there, right in the middle of campaign 2016, helping lead the chants of lock her up. And yet, and the same summer as he's then doing the chants, he's also doing his book tour with his fellow author, Michael Ledeen. Michael Ledeen, the guy who advocated for total war, talked about the alleged morality of just sometimes the United States has to pick up a third world and just smash it against the wall every so often to show the world what we're made of. And these are supposedly like the people who are going to like help lead the way to peace and rapprochement with Russia and all of that. And so what's underneath all of this is that there's a fake horseshoe. There's obviously a controlled dialectic, controlled oppositions, basically, in terms of the doves and the hawks in this longer term relationship to the Cold War, the East, the Soviet Union, and now Russia. And as we pointed out before, and it's very appropriate to again point it out here on the evening of September 11th of 2020, that the war on terror, it was not like there was all these big opponents to the war on terror. It was very similar in many ways in terms of the U.S. Congress. There was a lone dissenting vote post 9/11 about immediate military action, basically sort of give the unitary executive all total power to go throw someone against the wall, as Michael Ledeen would have it. It was Barbara Lee.
Ron Paul?
It was not Ron Paul, and it wasn't others who were in there.
McKinney or Kucinich. Ron Paul actually somewhat, he would always throw out we should go get the people who actually did this to us, but nothing else. So Ron Paul always threw that caveat in his rhetoric. So
right, he didn't call for having U.S. Marshals go detain Chabadnik Ari Fleischer with the Israeli intelligence linked up brother and find out who did this to us. No. Ron Paul wanted to justify how we had to be in the hills of Afghanistan to find the people who somehow stood down NORAD and got inside the Pentagon's computer systems and knew the Air Force One's code name and were standing right next to the president and blew up buildings in Ground Zero Manhattan.
Well, Jeremy, Ron Paul was able to make speeches in front of Congress that literally nobody sat in on about the neocons after the war had already started. So,
right.
Sorry, I used to love Ron Paul. I still do to an extent, but there's a lot of problems there.
So in a similar fashion to where there was just a lone Congress member in the U.S. who just called into question whether it was wise after an event where we still hadn't done any serious law enforcement, deep investigations into something like mass murder on American soil, where it makes sense to look at least somewhat, to means and opportunity. Not just motive, but also motive. Factor in some other motives, that call into question sort of giving full military constitutional war powers to the president immediately there. Similarly, the world reacted in a similar kind of way internationally, especially right after September 11th. And there was, it wasn't massive, but it was a substantial coalition that was gathered to go into Afghanistan. And at the very least, the big countries that were supposedly polar opposites or, other poles in the multipolar world, i.e., after the end of history of Fukuyama, right? It was going to be the attempt to extend the unipolar moment. But who do you extend the unipolar moment against but your leading rivals, right? It would have been China and Russia, right? And neither one of them, they basically, there was, murmurs, and of course, they vote in the UN sometimes against actions, but they basically also participated at the very least in terms of their domestic politics, especially in terms of, the Chechnya operations, but also just in terms of the larger narrative of the war on terror and how that operates domestically. And obviously the Chinese, in terms of the uptick and the massive escalation of their domestic total surveillance programs, and then the escalation against the Uyghur Muslims and all the weaponization and politics around that. But the base fact that cannot be avoided is that the war on terror was and continues to be a global operation, a transnational, or at least a multinational, and definitely a multipolar operation. And so we need to begin to unpack the depths of that.
Yes, and it remains to this day that, for the most part, the people who are the loudest in terms of the anti-war voices and condemning the wars as wars of imperialism, wars of empire, or whatever you want to call it, whatever terms you want to use, have not been forthright or honest in terms of addressing and acknowledging and exposing, quite frankly, what we, the very large, strong the obvious, copious amounts of evidence and facts that point to the events of September 11th, obviously at the very least being a lie, and at the very worst being what we, an all-out attack against this country, which led to all of these wars and genocides that they are so angry about in places like Iraq, for example. And, there's been still a general unwillingness to deal with that. Either that or now the serious one-point, quote, truther movement, with some exceptions. Whether you get into the whole InfoWars, Alex Jones, We Are Change sphere of things. they'll tell you, yeah, well, we were lied to on 9/11, but it was the deep state that did it, i.e. Trump's enemies who attacked us on 9/11. And ultimately, the people who did it are the enemies of Trump and of the allies of the patriots around Trump. And these are the people who are going to actually expose it. So you've got a couple of problems there. But by and large, within what we know as the anti-war movement, there's still been an unwillingness and inability, either knowingly or unknowingly, to honestly deal with the nature of what took place on September 11th, which brings us back to this anniversary. Did you want to say anything real quick before
I'd like to read this one section just to finish up the Sharansky section from Red Mafia, but I could do it after your comments, or I could do it now, whatever you want.
If you want to read that real quick, go for it.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Red Mafia, How the Russian Mob Has Invaded America by Robert I. Friedman, bottom of page 279 in the chapter called Global Conquest. Quote, one politician already ensnared in the web of organized crime is Russian-born Natan Sharansky, the head of the Russian Yisrael Ba'aliyah and Minister of the Interior in the government of Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Because of his resistance to the Soviet regime, alleged, and his strong and open identification with Judaism, maybe also alleged, he suffered a long, brutal confinement in the Gulag before international pressure led to his release. And by the way, remember, this is Natan Sharansky takes over the head of the Jewish Agency Board of Governors that is named in the chart that it was, put out there by veterans today, supposedly from the Able Danger FBI counterterrorism investigation itself. The Jewish Board of Governors is intimately in the mix in terms of the New York 9/11 operation, especially as a fixed point with the Israeli intelligence aspects of it, urban moving systems, and all of that. So I just want to and I believe that happened. I think Natan Sharansky took the helm of the executive board of the Jewish Agency in 2000 and post-Iraq War, maybe around 2005, actually around the same time when he was being exposed by the surgeon. Okay, all right. So back to page 280. Quote. He suffered a long, brutal confinement in the Gulag before international pressure led to his release. In Israel, the charismatic dissident was lionized by the Jewish people, and he became a power broker for the large and growing Russian émigré community, whom he helped integrate into a rigid society that sometimes seemed jealous of the talented new Russians. Right, Greg? See, also, this also shows that someone like... if this is the case, meaning Sharansky is actually a long-term illegal, a Soviet illegal in Israel, basically, a long-term high-level mole, he's not only doing transnational things in terms of influencing George W. Bush and the marketing of the war on terror, but he's also working an intelligence operation domestically in Israel, right? He's integrating the new Russian immigrants into the Russian society. Of course, that eventually leads into national security questions, if not real deep concerns about things like Talpiot and the technology takeover, yes, and all of that. Okay,
and it's And what was even Bill Clinton was quoted as saying that, like, the Russian nature of the immigration into Israel, isn't standing in the way of any type of, like, substantial moves in terms of of quote peace talks. Of course, we could talk all day about the validity of the quote peace end quote talks, especially with some of the people Clinton had surrounding him during his second administration when all the Monica Lewinsky intrigue was going on, by the way. But still, I mean, I think Bill Clinton was probably spot on in that assessment of the Russian speakers are really standing in the way, a real roadblock standing in the way of anything significant happening. And it's been talked about, like, the hawkishness of, like, these people. They're even more bigoted than, like, their Israeli contemporaries in terms of attitudes towards, the Palestinians or the other or the Arabs. And it's interesting when people like, Abby Martin do really good investigative documentary work on the going into Israel and talking to people about the bigoted attitudes of like some of the hardliners in Israel, you never hear about this aspect of the Russian nature of this immigration in that playing a major role in terms of like shifting attitudes to an even more extreme level over there. So
yes, exactly. Okay, let me finish reading this page here. Page 280, Red Mafia, chapter Global Conquest. Okay, so he's helping, quote, the growing Russian emigre community whom he helped integrate into a rigid society that sometimes seemed jealous of the talented new Russians. However, Sharansky has publicly admitted that his party has accepted campaign contributions from Nordex president Grigory Luchansky. Officials from the U.S. Congress, the State Department, and the CIA pleaded with Sharansky to sever his ties to Luchansky. Quote, we told Sharansky to stop taking money from Luchansky, says Weiner. I believe it's Jonathan Weiner, who, by the way, plays into all the accusations about the deep state framing Trump for Russia. I think he was in the mix there, too. Just like all of these people who had backgrounds in targeting Russian organized crime seem to have been the real target, not because they drummed up some fake case against Donald Trump, because it was notorious known about Donald Trump.
And they were at least somewhat over the target in ways that they probably weren't supposed to be.
Exactly. And by the way, this is a key point here too. Nordex, Luchansky, Nordex. I believe I'm correct about this, but I believe Nordex is that after the death of Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, the Israel super spy, but also a KGB super spy of some sort too, that I believe the sons and we sort of begun talking a lot more about the daughters. And they're crucial. Ghislaine's, what we titled the Talpiot twins, who were deep involved in, cyber companies and some of the origins of the World Wide Web and integrating it into FBI counterterrorism systems. What are their names again, Greg? The sisters? The
sisters. The names are escaping me. I can't pull them up right now. Isabel Maxwell and
I can't remember. That's all right. All right. So there's the Talpiot twins. They're crucial in the mix here. But the brothers, there's also the Maxwell brothers, and I believe that after Robert Maxwell's alleged death, I don't know, off the yacht, that the brothers went and worked with. They have a lot of like companies that they worked with. They're sort of like if the sort of Talpiot twins.
Christine Maxwell, Jeremy.
Christine, yeah, Greg, that iron trap of your mind. It's very powerful. The Talpiot twins, they're sort of the ones who got all the sort of deep in the mix in terms of the merger between Silicon Wadi and Silicon Valley, Israeli intelligence being, merged into, U.S. military intelligence at some level, cyber operations. Then Ghislaine is actually like the actual, human person, the human intelligence, the compromise network with Epstein, high level compromise. Then the brothers were actually sort of like the geoeconomics guys. They had tons of these financial instruments in companies. And remember, that's what Maxwell helped set up for the Soviet deep state, basically via someone like Mogilevich. He taught Mogilevich how to become the notoriously known brainy Don with his key skills in knowing how to wash money all around the world, all the way up including into New York-based banks, and so the brothers, I believe, worked at Nordex with Grigory Luchansky after the death of their father. And I'll look that up, but I'm almost positive that's the case. Nordex and the Maxwell brothers. So that sort of shows that this Sharansky network is very likely part and parcel of what the Maxwell network is. And then you begin to understand that the Epstein-Maxwell network is much bigger than just Israeli military intelligence. Okay. So finishing up this page 280, Red Mafia Global Conquest, quote, So this is Weiner, who's a U.S. State Department official. Quote, we told him about Luchansky's M.O., bribery, influence peddling, that he was a bridge between foreign governments and traditional organized crime, unquote. Sharansky simply refused, arguing that he needed the money to resettle the tidal wave of Russian emigres. Quote, when we warned Sharansky, unquote, says the congressional investigator, quote, to stop taking money from Luchansky, he said, but where am I going to put them? Referring to the huge influx of Russian Jewish refugees, quote, how am I going to feed them, find them jobs, unquote. He figures Luchansky is just another source of income. Sharansky is very shrewd, the congressional investigator continued, quote, he knows better. It was a cynical decision. He did take money. Then he asked, why shouldn't I? The CIA warned him that Luchansky was trying to buy influence through him and his party for the Russian organized crime, Russian government Combine. We told Sharansky that Luchansky is a major crook, unquote. Sharansky declined to comment. That's interesting. And then final paragraph here. Ignoring all the warnings, Sharansky introduced Luchansky to Benjamin Netanyahu prior to Israel's 1996 national elections, right? Same elections as Arthur Finkelstein coming into the mix. The Arthur Finkelstein, whose network, or Arthur Finkelstein himself, and then helped mainstream Donald Trump into the Republican Party right prior to the Republican National Committee convention, and then his network of the...
In full circle. Full circle, you have the clean break document ready to go on Netanyahu's desk almost as soon as he's inaugurated.
There you go. So I think if you see the Sharansky situation from the east, sort of bringing in the Russian deep state operations, and then you see the Finkelstein bringing in the American deep state operations, all converging there in Israel, along with that third key component that you mentioned of the clean break paper that sort of articulates what we're then going to see in the next quarter of a century, basically. And you really begin to understand a large arc, I think, here in terms of the post-World War global geopolitical logics. Okay, and then finally, so ignoring all the warnings, Sharansky introduced Luchansky to Benjamin Netanyahu prior to Israel's 1996 national elections. The Israeli press reported that Netanyahu received $1.5 million in campaign contributions from Luchansky, a charge the prime minister hotly denied. Quote, the Likud is corrupt and Bibi Netanyahu is disgusting, unquote, says Weiner, i.e. the target of the anti-Trump, the target of all the Trumpists, basically. Quote, he's had meetings with Luchansky and Kobzon, criminals promoting their own interests, unquote. Kobzon's influence in Israel may exceed that of even Luchansky and Mogilevich. Okay, that's enough of that. Thank you for letting me finish that, Greg.
No, thank you for bringing all this deep information, and it's very, very important facets and layers to understand that I'm sure we will zero in on again in the future. So, and it all relates to this bigger, this bigger topic. And now finally, I'll go back to what I was, go back to where I was at before with, talking about like what I saw as the, I don't know if ominous, dark, certainly deceitful nature of like this 9/11 anniversary in terms of all that we've, been told about Trump recently, the overall environment and mood and climate in the country right now, with this most uncertain election that it appears like nobody's going to accept the results of, which is unprecedented. All of that surrounding. I was going to make my final point about Ari Fleischer, what we were talking about before, is that it's really particularly disgusting to see Ari Fleischer on TV on September 11th with what you laid out about him. And this makes him one of the point men on the ground, along with the numerous figures in New York City, along with maybe somebody like Dov Zakheim in the Pentagon, and then obviously Cheney, as the point men, basically domestically, that were controlling the operation reactions too. And, Ari Fleischer's on Fox News saying he's disgusted when people don't, kneel, do not stand for the national anthem. I mean, give me a break. But it's so, coming full circle with that was pretty nasty to see. And so that was, Ari Fleischer was the lead into that, quote, peace, end quote, deal between Israel UAE with Bahrain being added into it. And I was making a point about how this September 11th anniversary, at least from the Trump side of things. Of course, obviously, the entire political establishment is complicit in this ongoing lie. As we see, there's a few things that that both sides of the deep state, all sides of the deep state swamp can all agree on. And one of the things they can all agree on every single year is that, yes, we were attacked by the brown enemy, the enemies on September 11th, and we must remember this and never forget what it means, and the propaganda all coming out in the big displays of celebration, somber celebration. I mean, that's one thing everybody in the D.C. and New York and wherever swamps can all agree on is that, we were attacked on September 11th and happened exactly the way the government and the 9/11 Commission, whoever else says it did, and we must constantly remind people that this happened exactly the way it did. So that's one thing everybody can agree about. But particularly when it comes to the Trump side of things, the current president, what I'm seeing is this is a celebration of the most hardline elements domestically in this country of the country, that being Israel, that we can pinpoint from a domestic perspective and from an international perspective as being right at the epicenter of this September 11th operation, with the symbolism of this, quote, peace deal, and even Trump being touted as an anti-war president because he's bringing us closer to our greatest ally with these peace deals, quote unquote. That, and then this Medal of Honor ceremony for these soldiers who had fought against ISIS and in various chapters and theaters of the war on terror. And we've talked about Trump as a president representing the most extreme, the most hardline, the actual war on terror in terms of its actual meaning, that it is actually a war against the civilization of evil people who are out to destroy us and hurt us. And that combined with the obvious, very symbolic and very, I think, deliberately symbolic nature of all of this celebrating of Israel going on this day openly in the White House by the administration. It, to me, in addition to just completely belying this image of the anti-war president and Trump being the anti-establishment guy who's just standing up against all the enemies of his who are all rose up to destroy the patriotic president who's trying to do what's right. This is a celebration of not just September 11th as we normally celebrate it, but a celebration of the worst of the operation as far as the country that is so at the center of, from a foreign perspective, domestic perspective, central to figuring out the September 11th operation in full, and also the worst of what what has been done to the mindset of our population as far as this idea of fighting this war against this invisible enemy that's also a threat to literally kill thousands of us on any given day.
Yeah, I think that's a very crucial piece of this, that people who are too readily accepting this whole narrative of Trump as the de-escalator in chief or the anti-war guy really don't get about how the war on terror is the rubric, and he's always bragging on that. He on also killing the terrorists.
One thing, yes, I believe it was in a speech he made today that he bragged about killing Soleimani and Baghdadi.
Yes, he did, and he said it during his acceptance speech at the RNC, and he always brags on it. And you got to remember back to what was actually going on earlier, beginning of this year, before the whole COVID escalation. But early January, after that assassination, during that assassination itself, it was that was a horrible global tension and a horrible situation, and it's still a horrible situation. Imagine if that had been done to an American general,
Well, Jeremy, clearly John Bolton put some type of mind control device in Trump to make him do that.
You're right.
Because he'd been gone for months before that happened. But all we keep hearing about to this day is, the Boltons were the warmongers who were making Trump do those terrible things. Well, Bolton had been out for at least 4 months before that assassination.
It's crazy too. Even seeing the Bolton, there is some aspect where I think even the Michael Haydens, even if maybe he's some kind of, useful idiot of some sort, like a Chertoff dupe of some sort. But I almost get the sense, that similar to our analysis of the neocon split, where the neocons that people focused on so much, at least during the George W. Bush years and the sort of immediate post 9/11 era of the sort of leadership of the Project for the New American Century and the Bill Kristols and the Kagans and all that, we've identified them, I think rightfully, as the paleo-neocons. And so it's very possible that people like these Haydens, and even there's an aspect of Bolton who's very, it's very possible that these are all the paleo-neocons who really did believe in the new American century, even if it was fused at the hip with the Israeli Likud, but that, there's something sobering in their eyes and the way they're talking right now. Even Bolton, to me, this is not all just a front. There's something about what they've seen in relationship to how dangerous this Trump operation is to even the potential ongoing coherence of the country that we know it as, the United States of America. I think that sort of has them, what they say about liberals mugged by reality. Well, maybe paleo neocons mugged by reality become some kind of new paleo liberals. I don't know.
You never know, but I mean, a couple things on that. Number one is absolutely they still, I believe, have and I know you agree with me on this, a duty and an obligation to condemn. At the very least, I do think a lot of mea culpas need to be made in terms publicly regarding, their activities and complicity. Certainly, if at the very least, from a very hardcore propaganda level, as far as the original crimes, the original sins of the Bush era post September 11th wars. But I think you're making a point here, and it's very interesting. I'm just even observing this even with somebody like Bolton. It's interesting the combination of Bolton being like the guy to point at as being like the warmonger from within, right? That combined with just the uniformity of how like all of these really the big time propagandists within like the MAGA world unanimously just completely threw Bolton under the bus as this book came out. I mean, it's very interesting, and Bolton very likely, as we've talked about before, there's a chance of compromise even going back perhaps to the 1980s and the old Plato's Retreat nightclub and some allegations out there about him. But it is very interesting that you do have this Bolton who, just the way, the uniformity and the swiftness and just like how quickly everybody he did not have a single ally among a lot of people who before were considered like good friends of his. He did not have a single ally left, even after relatively tame criticisms of Trump in his book. It's very interesting.
And so no matter what happens in terms of the quote unquote election coming up, I totally agree with you, Greg, about the even if the Trump threat is cleared in some way or whatever, then it's going to be even more important, especially for the people who got into the public speech, environment in this post 11/9 era and are sort of form the core of the resistance to. Especially for them, but also I agree with you in terms of these actual players on the ground, like a Bolton. People should go back to our show we did when Bolton came in, where we disclose the facts that show that Condoleezza Rice was not an extreme enough neocon and not loyal enough to Israeli Likud for Bolton, and he was even going behind the back of Condoleezza Rice to the Israelis, it appears like. But for those people to have their faces put in their dung of that era and account for their crimes, but also for the people who are who have sort of recently quote woken up because of Donald Trump. They then have to go back from 11/9 to 9/11 and stop covering up for the event that set all of this off in many ways, and that like we've talked we're talking about before, that the people who are in the mix here, including a Michael Hayden, only guy who was ever at the head of both the CIA and the NSA, and both in the wake of September 11th. He was at the NSA on September 11th and then moved into the CIA after. Someone like that who then goes to work for Chertoff is at the very least is not some kind of patriot to just be commended on Twitter because he said some things about Donald Trump. We have to get to the root of this. It didn't start with Donald Trump, and it's not going to end with Donald Trump unless we get to the root of it.
Indeed, and honestly, endorsing Biden is not like the strongest indication of like any type of like. But you're right. All full circle all around with these people, from Michael Hayden's to the the Lincoln Project, Rick Wilson, Steve Schmitz of the world, and dare I even say the Crystals and the Frums and the whoever else is of the world. I mean, there's some serious. And I, honestly, in my deepest levels, I highly doubt we'll get this. But we would need, and it would be much welcome if any of these people are like. They to really be honest about like the nature of what they helped to bring into place and what they helped to set the stage for. So, the John Kasichs of the world, the Colin Powells of the world. And
in order for there to be even a hope of that, the people who are against the 11/9 operation in the form of the Trump regime are going to have to wake their asses up. And deal with these people in their midst. And I understand the realpolitik at some level in terms of they see their mission right now is, the enemy of their enemy is their friend, or it's worse than that. But I understand their desire to keep their coalition as they see the crucial mission as the November situation. However, that's not going to do it. Even if they were to be successful in that mission, and let's say that mission is of good faith in terms of the protection of the long-term viability of the country and the republic, these much deeper issues of the people who are in their midst need to be dealt with, and that a lot of that can be dealt with by looking very, very honestly and deeply into what September 11th was, who did it, and why, because we're still living in that era.
And I would say, on top of that, that includes a day of reckoning and a serious look at Harris as well, but especially at Biden, who's been in office forever and has been complicit in so many of these terrible domestic and foreign policy decisions of the last 4.5 decades. So.
Right. The best thing that could be said about Biden is that he and Obama helped cover up 9/11 while escalating the war on terror and being responsible for the deaths of many more thousands, if not millions, around the world in different ways.
Yeah, and I'll make this quick point. For me, like you hear all the time about the Obama corruption, the Obama scandals. A lot of that's weaponized by the right, but I mean, there's some truth to some of these scandals, and I think some of them are also largely exaggerated. Like from a foreign policy perspective, Obama's biggest crimes allegedly, Benghazi, which what difference does it make Hillary Clinton, or allegedly giving money to the mullahs in Iraq, and even like Iran, the biggest lies of the biggest criticisms of Obama-era foreign policy are still fitting into this whole idea of the war on terror. Oh, Obama gave those evil Iranians money rather than this, or you never hear about the money given to Israel for that matter, $38 billion.
And that was actually that was actually Iranian money. I mean, they don't talk about it. It was a sort of a return of money that had been held in terms of the sanctions, I believe. So it's not like it was like a payoff. So I think actually in large part a lot of the whatever it was, most of the actual political attacks from his political opposition in the U.S. on Obama was largely contrived. Oh, yeah. While, as you're pointing out, the much deeper aspect and the preservation and the escalation of the war on terror aspects, which is the most core criminal corrupt thing that Obama did in conjunction to the war crimes abroad.
Yeah, it was the people who were against the Iran deal that were the who's who of what we've talked about, like the worst of like the the national security and military hardliners. I mean, basically a who's who of Council for National Policy, who's who of governmental figures, war crime, national security, who's who that all are basically now coalesced in this Trump operation. So you're right about that, but from a foreign policy perspective, those are Obama's biggest crimes, right? And then those who want to pretend to care about wars will claim that Obama, he killed, all the people he killed with drones. But meanwhile, they don't care when Trump does it, or they, it's like a prop, Obama did this. Like, they can feel good about themselves because they're condemning something Obama did when they really don't care if, like, Trump does it, or in terms of, like, vilifying the people in those, in as far as the enemies of the war on terror. But, those are the biggest crimes and scandals of the Obama era. Meanwhile, for me, I would add, like, the extrajudicial assassinations of, in terms of drone strikes and other methods. But I would also add, I think the biggest crimes from a foreign policy perspective were the perpetuation of the Bush era, post September 11th. The continued cover-up combined with Obama not following through on his promise to close Guantanamo Bay. And those are, that right there is such a huge, and of course the lack of accountability and all things related to, torture. Let's look forward. Let's not look backward. So basically, to me, and then even Libya and Syria are advanced. Libya, obviously the removal of Gaddafi, and then Syria with all of the all the activities we talked about that we laid out before, and what we see going on with Syria and the rise of ISIS and the response to that. All continuations of this longer operation that was in place based on the big lie, as we call it. And so that, to me, the Obama legacy, you want to talk about it. It's not Benghazi and giving money to mullahs in Iran that already belonged to them in the first place. No, it is the extrajudicial assassinations. It is the perpetual continued opening of Guantanamo Bay, which is supposed to be closed, and now not only is still open and still holds the alleged 9/11 suspects who were waterboarded ungodly number of times and tortured in who knows how many different ways and methods, combined with now it's the place where all the traitors who are against Trump are going to be sent to. You still have that. You still have, that was the biggest crime, is the perpetuation of this myth of this war on terror. To me, is what the biggest foreign policy crime of the Obama administration was. Oh yeah, and it's similarly even to aspects of the Clinton administration, where the big scandal of the Clinton administration was Monica Lewinsky, where the impeachment comes from, right? And I would say very likely in a similar fashion that something like Benghazi to Obama, that what none of Clinton's Republican opposition were going to say was that it was the Lewinsky thing was not about just bringing shame to the office around the cigar and the blue dress and the filth on American TV and the lying about depends on what the meaning of the is or is whatever, but actually, that was very likely Israeli military intelligence compromise operation that went right in the wake of the Jeffrey Epstein operation, where the sitting president was visiting the sex trafficker in his Wexner brownstone while he was the sitting POTUS, compromised by an Israeli military intelligence operation, or Amdocs, Israeli military intelligence being deployed inside of the White House comm system, then the political capstone of that, Monica Lewinsky. And of course, none of so that's how it's not an actual opposition. And so similarly with Benghazi and Obama, it's very likely that was something very similar. You go look at the background of that, look at all the timing, even look at the role of someone like that pastor from down in Florida and the networks he was working
Jerry
for.
Jones, yeah.
And then even the operation of someone like the Blumenthals in relationship to highlighting it for the left and all of that. There's something going on there where it looks to be like some kind of potentially even foreign intelligence operation similar to the big scandals of the Clinton administration that even his domestic foes would not even touch.
Well, if you're going to deal with Clinton and brownstones and Epstein and Wexner, then you've got to deal with the possible questions around what's largely left out of the Epstein Island narrative and the conventional narrative that, it was only these deep state, demon rat opponents and enemies of Trump who were involved in anything with Epstein. But then you have to raise the question of possible blackmail and compromise operations being done with Trump and Epstein at these Wexner, brownstone properties. So that's probably something people don't want to touch, possibly in part for that reason as well.
And Donald Trump was never on the Lolita Express, except for he wasn't he?
I believe it came out he was, but once again, you can see a major player in this whole,
operation. It was Roger Stone via InfoWars airwaves that put into people's minds that Trump had nothing to do with any of it. So,
and by the way, the Three Musketeers of the a little bit earlier era was Trump, Epstein, and Thomas Barrack, who becomes the epicenter of the Manafort operation and the 11/9 operation, and the key sort of American quote-unquote oligarch that connects to the UAE connection, and George Nader and all of that, who then is also a tie-in to the Israelis, but is also then very obviously the connection from the Middle East back to Russia. So that is that triplicate there of Trump, Thomas Barrack, and Jeffrey Epstein running around Manhattan in either the late 80s or early 90s or something like that, but definitely around the time where the accusations on the court record about the teenagers being allegedly raped by Epstein and Trump emerged from.
Yes, indeed. And so there's a lot of things that don't want to be touched by these partisan hacks who ultimately don't really reveal anything, and so or anything really of substance, to kind of turn these court hearings and these House committee hearings and all that into these ridiculous partisan circuses that are just impossible to really take seriously. But and you mentioned real quick, Paul Manafort, and something I think somewhat of an important aspect of the post-September 11th operation that we've addressed before. We've talked about a little bit, and we have talked about, but I don't think is known well enough. I think it's something that's very much flown under the radar over the years. Is the fact that one of the companies that was called in to clean up the World Trade Center was the company, Paul Manafort's family company, the Manafort Brothers Construction Company. You think about that, and you think about the role of Giuliani as being the person who would oversee who was brought in to do all that cleaning up, and then the shipment, I believe, in the last days of the Giuliani administration of the World Trade Center steel, I believe, to China. I think that becomes an important aspect to think about and to follow up on. I think that would be it's very interesting. I've noticed it's caught the eye of some of the serious Trump-Russia researchers such as Eric Garland, but I would advise the Eric Garlands of the world and other people in that realm that this is one step to take, and if you can take this step, then hopefully there are some other serious steps you can take to help you understand perhaps what really went on, and that even like a lot of these people in your resistance spheres are not your friends when it comes to things like the continued 9/11 cover-up and understanding even a longer-term Russian-centric operation against the U.S., in terms of understanding the significance of September 11th on a number of fronts that I do think implicate some interesting international figures that very much figure into Russia and as well as to this international organized crime syndicate. And so the role of the Manafort brothers being involved in that cleanup, I think, is and it's still the full scope of that needs to be, I think, really figured out and zeroed in on more. But I think that's a pretty important and significant factor that's largely been overlooked over the last 19 years.
Yes, that's a key piece of this, and people need to reconsider the Manafort connection here. And actually, the first chapter of Seth Abramson's new book, Proof of Corruption, deals directly with what the Manafort background and his relationship to Deripaska and Firtash, for example, in the Ukrainian to Russian sphere actually means about the 11/9 intelligence operation that was being run via the Trump campaign, which, of course, more and more, especially with the release of the Senate Intelligence Counterintelligence report, shows that the anchor hinge piece is Israel and, more generally, their Arab partners in the Middle East that are being uncloaked right now. But I also agree that, like, for some people like the Eric Garlands of the world, it is past time to come, like, patriotically correct and truthful about things such as, September 11th and what this Manafort involvement, which in many ways is, of course, sort of derivative to the people who actually blew up the people in the towers, the people who actually made the operation happen, who very likely, and I don't think we'll do that tonight, but I think we should go back to reinvestigating the who, what, why, when, where, how of 9/11, the means, motive, and opportunity, the tripartite structure that we broke down before of looking at it as a military operation, an intelligence operation, and then a counterintelligence operation, i.e. a cover-up operation, in a way that we did in terms of assessing it in relationship from 9/11 to 11/9. But for the Eric Garlands of the world, hopefully the Manafort connection to 9/11 could open it up in a similar way, that understanding that the Epstein-Clinton connection can very readily become just a cover-up for the Epstein-Trump connection. And similarly, the Epstein, Mohammed bin Salman Saudi connection, which is very real. He had a picture of bin Salman on his desk, I believe, around the time of the Trump election, just as he had these portraits of these compromising portraits of George W. Bush and Bill Clinton in his home. But of course, the Epstein relationship with the Saudi ruler MBS is really a limited hangout and a controlled, unpatriotic, deceptive, really a misprision of 9/11 treason understanding to the Epstein-Israeli connection, very obviously. And I'd say it's basically exactly the same in relationship to September 11th, as we begin to further unpack the multipolar aspects of everything from 11/9 to 9/11 to Epstein, where there are these tie-ins, just as there is with this Sharansky figure, who's at the epicenter of the post-9/11 world from an American empire perspective and from an Israeli realpolitik government perspective, and yet there's this very, very questionable long-term, intelligence backdoor to Russia. So I think that needs to be dealt with, and I think we should continue to, maybe we should even do a remix of from 9/11 to 11/9. Maybe what we could do is we could do from 11/9 to 9/11 actually, and sort of reconsider now what we know about the Trump operation. We can then look back towards 9/11 and maybe uncover some stuff about that. And maybe my last little point for tonight would be, in terms of 9/11, would be thinking about the crucial aspect of Maurice Hank Greenberg, AIG, his son, Marsh McClellan. And I've started to read this book, Black 9/11, Money, Motive, and Technology by Mark H. Gaffney, that has some very interesting questions in it. And it's very interesting because it tries to unpack, just like it says, money, motive, and technology. And the technology is largely focused on questions about the Boeing systems, remote control, and that's a crucial thing, because you go look at where exactly the towers were hit, and it's exactly towards the bottom of the recently reconstructed areas, both towers, right? And they're also, flying into these the AIG Marsh McClellan apparati there, and they're very similarly to the Pentagon. Where was the Pentagon hit? It's not hit on the side of the brass, of the Pentagon brass, of the Donald Rumsfelds, of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or even of the acting Joint Chiefs of Staff, current Kansas State President Dick Myers, the alleged general, who just didn't turn up that day, somehow didn't end up in the Pentagon when it went blowing up, and the office that was looking into the $2.3 trillion of the messed up, the missing trillions that were unaccounted for of the long-term black budget of the Pentagon got struck, and basically everybody, all of the accountants, basically went dead. And Richard Myers, acting head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's got his sort of plush job now as the president of Kansas State, he somehow was not there, and his part of the Pentagon was not even hit in the first place. And instead of that, it was this very loop-de-loop kind of a pathway that was much more difficult, and then bam, whatever it is. And I think I think these sort of, a lot of the technicalities of this is very complicated and layered, almost in order to be confusing and complex and difficult to unpack. But most important here is what this is honing in on: money, motive, and then the technology question helps explain potentially the who did it and why. And he really makes some really crucial points about Greenberg and AIG, in the background of AIG coming out of China. And the guy who started it, Hank Greenberg's father, was his chauffeur, and then he saw promise in Greenberg. And the reason I bring this up is sort of my final point here. And I maybe I won't read. I was going to read a little bit from the book, and talks all about how the Kroll operation happened, and then the targeting of Elliot Spitzer in relationship to I believe he was Attorney General. I think
by Roger Stone in part.
Right. And so that let's just mention that at the very least in terms of tying this back into 11/9, because that's what made me think of it, is the Center for National Interests, which is really at the epicenter of understanding how this whole thing was brought into the fold, and who sits there together: Henry Kissinger and Hank Greenberg, right? So that is crucial to understand that. And so Roger Stone being at the epicenter of this, and you've over and over highlighted, Greg, Stone's role in the Spitzer operation, and it's very interesting how the timing of all that seems
he defended to me on the InfoWars airwaves.
Well, this would be very interesting, actually, Greg, to maybe go back through that and then read through some of the timing about what Spitzer was actually looking into in relationship to AIG, and remember what actually happened in relationship to the money flow on September 11th around Wall Street. It was basically, it came down, there was some put options. Someone had some foreknowledge. Maybe it was a few $1 million. And then, it turned out that they seemed to tie back to Buzzy Krongard, the, deputy operations guy, I believe, at the Central Intelligence Agency formerly, but then at Deutsche Bank, right? And he's running all of the private foreign banking operations. That sort of sounds like potentially like right in the epicenter of money laundering, right? We really know Deutsche Bank, the epicenter of the Trump operation, the epicenter of the Red Mafia money laundering, the epicenter even of the Epstein money operations is right there. And then it turned out that this was replete. And what happens, and he describes, Gaffney describes this in Black 9/11, is that the whether it's the SEC or one aspect of the federal government basically deputized all of the people who had some knowledge to investigate this. And then what it meant was that they could not talk about what they learned publicly, or else they'd be violating something like a non-disclosure or a national security letter of some sort, because what it turned out was that this was replete. Of course, the ground zero was not only ground zero physically of the high technology that vaporized human bodies, but it was also the ground zero of all of this money flow going on. There's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of last second transactions being done in servers, even in the trade towers and all of that. And so a lot of this seems to sort of move in very similar circles as we're beginning to now see in relationship to the 11/9 operation. So maybe we'll return to this in the future, Greg.
Yeah, and you're very right about bringing in the Center for National Interest, and we've talked before about Greenberg and AIG and his son being in control of Marsh and McLennan, where hundreds of people are burning to death, while Paul Bremer, who goes on to be the provincial head of Iraq after Saddam Hussein fled and gave up power, goes on TV in a similar capacity to Ehud Barak and blames bin Laden for the attacks. And we've talked about that. And we talked about Kissinger and the 9/11 Commission, and the fact that these two guys, Greenberg more indirectly because his son was the head of Marsh and McLennan, Jeffrey Greenberg, but indirectly, but still certainly in the know regarding some of the aspects of what was going on within that whole milieu and sphere of interest. And by the way, it was also I believe the main building that was hit. I believe it was the Cantor Fitzgerald section of the World Trade Center. Of course, that would be Howard Lutnick.
Right. I forgot that, Greg. That's crucial, right? That's the next door neighbor of Epstein, right? And the Chabadnik to Pat,
Yeah, and I was at the, hosting the big fundraiser for Trump within weeks of the Epstein arrest at his posh New York, estate, mansion, whatever you'd call the property he lives on. So,
by the way, Greg, the one little factoid here, very interesting, is that page 31, quote, Greenberg was quote, the CEO of Marsh & McLennan on 9/11 was Jeffrey Greenberg, as you said, son of Maurice Hank Greenberg, owner of AIG, the world's largest insurance conglomerate, or second largest, depending on the source. Greenberg's other son, Evan, was CEO of Ace Limited, another large insurance company. Maurice Greenberg had been a director of the New York Federal Reserve Bank for many years. Remember, this is also the epicenter of where the money flows from the Red Mafia. We're coming into the United States too, right? So more and more we're beginning to see a global flow here. And in 1994 to 95 served as its chairman. Greenberg was also vice chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, which, as already noted, sponsored his 1996 report, quote, Making Intelligence Smarter, the Future of U.S. Intelligence, quote. And it's interesting, people say I found the report, but I haven't read any of it yet. But supposedly, the crib note is basically, it says, the best thing is if the U.S. intelligence can make nice with basically the global black economy.
By the way, Jeremy, this is an interesting full circle you mentioned with Greenberg being one of the Council on Foreign Relations. In addition to Kissinger, who's also been a long-term fixture at the Council on Foreign Relations. For people, see the CFR as being like the epicenter of a long-term, anti-American conspiracy or whatever. This would be a likely continuation of that. Would be these figures within the Council on Foreign Relations also being very centric to this multipolar Russian-Chinese angle as well.
Yes, and like John Brisson makes a good point. I think he says that 9/11 is basically that the project for a new American century is basically a hybrid warfare operation between the CFR and then the CNP. And so that's very, very interesting, especially in relationship to what you just mentioned. And then so finally in this paragraph, and this is what I thought you might find interesting, Greg, is, quote, as a result of that report, Senator Arlen Specter floated Greenberg's name as a candidate for the directorship of the CIA.
Oh, boy.
Magic Bullet Specter. You can never imagine.
Yeah.
Oh, and who, by the way, replaced Specter? Holler at your homeboy.
It was in the, I believe, the Pennsylvania
Joe
primary.
Sestak.
Yes, the Pennsylvania primary. Joe Sestak defeated Arlen. I believe it was in the Pennsylvania primary, defeated Arlen Specter, and then he ended up losing to the current swamp dweller out of Pennsylvania, that being Pat Toomey. So,
how about that as an independent presidential ticket? Joe Sestak and Justin Amash. That'd be sort of interesting.
Yeah, we know. Yes, that would be very interesting to say the least. There's a world of possibility. They're probably better than the Unity 2020 of Tulsi Gabbard and Dan Crenshaw.
Well, luckily, I think they're not going to accept it. That's a whole. Come on now. Come on, Joe Sestak and Justin Amash. Not the Zionist pirate and Tulsi, whoever she is.
The Zionist pirate. I love it. So I guess we should. I guess it's getting to be around time to start to wrap up here. Jeremy, do you want to take maybe a little bit of time for just a few minutes for people who aren't really familiar with some of our background story? I know we discussed, I think, in the very first show we did kind of our backgrounds and how we got into this line of thinking with regards to September 11th. But as far as like where we kind of came into this and how we've evolved our perspectives on this matter over the years, I was thinking maybe both of us could close this portion out by maybe we could close this recording out by taking a few minutes to just give a little bit of idea where we came from and how we've evolved.
That's a good idea. Okay, so I graduated from college, Williams College in Western Massachusetts in the Berkshires, in 2001. I actually was meant to graduate in 2000, but I took a year off and went back to live and work in Los Angeles. And so I ended up graduating that spring. And then I actually had found a job in southern Vermont, a really cool teaching job where I was going to be the music teacher for this whole school. And I believe it was either K through 6 or K through 8, and found this really cool house up in a hill in the woods with a friend who was taking a year off from college at Williams. And then right before the semester started at school, I took a trip to visit my family back home in LA. And so I was actually with them on September 11th. And I remember I'd slept in that day a little bit. And so it had already started happening when I woke up 3 hours earlier there. And then I remember seeing stuff on TV, and I remember it feeling very Hollywood. And the one thing that sticks out in my mind in relationship to September 11th, the day of, was two things, actually. It felt there was a sort of Hollywood sort of scripting to it, which at that point I sort of bought a little bit, in terms of I could imagine these guys slipping through somehow. But I think it was probably based on sort of movies and that kind of scripting. And then I remember, what's his name? Pachenik's co-author.
Tom Clancy.
Tom Clancy. I believe they put Tom Clancy on television on September 11th morning. And even at that point, I knew that, what the heck is that? That's weird. Why did they put this guy, this like fiction writer on TV on September 11th? I believe I'm correct about that. But meanwhile, then I went back to live in southern Vermont and do teaching and music and make music with a bunch of people from New England and friends from all around Eastern Seaboard, really, and didn't really catch up in terms of politics. And I wasn't really deeply, I didn't have a deep understanding of politics, my family come from like a, fairly maybe progressive, Democrat voters. I remember listening to Iran-Contra hearings when I was young in the car with my mom, and probably like on Pacifica radio or something like that. And my mom was like, we would talk about politics and along with my dad and stuff like that, but never really about deep politics. And so I didn't really get it so much. I remember, so after graduating from college, I did not understand what this was. I understand there was major problems with the war. I was a peace activist, even did some work with a peace lobby during my year off from college, and actually went back and worked with that same organization later on, Peace Action. And so I knew that the wars were wrong and fraudulent, and I had some sense about the Iraq War. But at that point, it was still sort of, the World Wide Web was not well developed. And I remember, especially when we were living in the hills and stuff like that, barely getting like little bits of radio, catching little bits of like NPR maybe, or maybe some kind of like Democracy Now! Every so often in the morning from like the Vermont college station or something like that. And I remember every so often hearing like Noam Chomsky explaining blowback and things like that, but nothing really broke through, except I remember receiving a Deception dollar outside of a hip-hop show in, I think, Northampton, Massachusetts, and actually taking it back and looking some stuff up on the internet. And a lot of it was like Michael Rupert links and stuff like that, and it all seemed to be sort of like let it happen. There was nothing, and this is why I think that talking about the demolitions are so important, because there are epistemological hard fact grounding in reality that can be really confirmed by our senses with some kind of common sense analysis, in a way that all of this talk about, Pakistani ISI and people knew, and there was this money, and and all of this kind of stuff didn't quite impact me enough to sort of open my awareness to understanding what this really meant about how fraudulent and big this deception really was. And it was not just the Iraq war lies. And I do remember about that same time, like watching Michael Moore's film in the theater with some of my friends when it came out. Fahrenheit 9/11, and it began to there were some more questions and stuff like that. But still, it's just. Bush just sort of was golfing too much, and I did at that point. I didn't really know enough to go, do some searching about the background of who's producing the films, whether it was JFK or Michael Moore's agent, Ari Emanuel, or any of that kind of stuff. And so it wasn't really until I got back to Los Angeles in 2005 when I began to hear, and I got to give it up to KPFK and the Pacifica Radio Network. They were playing lectures by David Ray Griffin. They were even playing audio from Loose Change Second Edition. And although there's lots of, problems with that film factually in terms of its analysis, things it doesn't cover, obviously, especially in terms of Israel, it was at the very least the combination of David Ray Griffin and knowing that there were books that I could go read and I could look at all of the debunker sites and then that plus Loose Change and Loose Change the second one was a very good film, which was why it was powerful. And sure, people who didn't know how to actually sort of do deeper research on either side, whether they sort of got followed Loose Change into the sort of prison planet mind state in the sort of We Are Change trap of some sort, and there's a whole background there with We Are Change LA and all of that I've talked about some before, and I won't go into all of that now. But either sort of, being able sort of falling into that trap or into the reactionary trap of finding out that there was some factual questions about Loose Change 2 and then basically sort of chalking it up to Michael Shermer and, is the expert on 9/11 or something like that, or Dick Cheney's, he's a bad guy, but he's not that bad,
Or the Chertoff cousin from Popular Mechanics.
Right, and I don't know if that was actually. I don't even know if that
one ever
even actually
related. I heard that. Maybe they weren't.
Right. I don't know if that.
Well, the gentleman with the last name Chertoff from Popular
Ben
Mechanics.
Chertoff from Popular Mechanics. But the more important thing is the Hearst publications in general go back to the USS Maine, yellow journalism in terms of the Spanish-American War, making the assault on the indigenous American agriculture of cannabis and small farmers and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I guess, so I really began to assess September 11th starting with a little bit, like I said, inklings in around 2003, 2004, but really 2005, when I got back to LA, I hear on the radio these lectures, I hear the documentary, I watched the documentary, then I start doing my due diligence. I start doing my reading, and that includes all the debunkers and stuff like that. So I immediately start trying to sort of knock out the straw men, the bad facts, and then, about a year of study, I had a good sense that this was very serious and very real, and that it needed to be integrated into my peace and justice activism. And so then I would say I became a truth activist in that era, and then been working to evolve, into a clear consideration of the truth. And then when you and I met, first online, then we started the Antedote in 2016. It's really these last years of working with you, Greg, has just been a massive catalyst towards my understanding in terms of the larger dynamics, both of September 11th, but also the bigger dynamics of what September 11th means about the world.
Well, for me, when I was on September 11th, I was 13 years old. I was in seventh grade. No, I think I just started 8th grade, actually. I'm getting a little bit behind on the particular timeline, but I was in school. I was in middle school, and I was in 8th grade, and there was an announcement over the intercom that something had happened, and basically an attack. And I had no understanding as like a 13-year-old at the time of what that meant. And honestly, I never thought too much of it, even though I will say one of the best decisions of my life that I made was to not sign up when the military recruiters came to my high school campus, because there were probably, I can remember at least 6 or 7 different occasions where the Army, Air Force, Army, Navy, Air Force recruiters would come into our cafeterias in my high school and would try to sign people up. And like, there were about 2 or 3 different times where I had actually agreed to have a representative come over to my house. And like, for some reason, I benefit of hindsight, I'm so thankful I did this. But with the benefit of hindsight, I am so thankful that I, at the last minute, just got cold feet and decided not to follow through on it.
Wow.
Because, yeah, I mean, they were all over my campus. It's very interesting, me being in a more, they look for either, rural kids, from rural, say, Midwestern states, or else people who are kind of lower income, inner city residents. And, me going to an inner city high school in Kansas City, Missouri, I guess would be a target for military recruiting. And so it was interesting. I didn't obviously understand that at the time, but, going back now, I can see, like, the significance of having circa 2004, 2005, 2006, having military recruiters all over even a high school campus at the time. So, but honestly, in terms of September 11th and politics, I didn't think much more of it for several years until the first time I thought about September 11th really critically was actually 2007, one of the presidential debates. There was a moment at one of the 2007 presidential debates where Ron Paul mentioned that we're attacked, the other countries, they attack us because of blowback for what we do in their countries. And, Rudy Giuliani had responded by insulting Ron Paul and saying that's the worst excuse I've ever heard for terrorism. And so at the time, like, that was a really big deal for me. This is when I was starting to become a Ron Paul supporter. I had been kind of brought into the Ron Paul line of thinking, and I was somewhat passionate. I mean, 2008, I had joined up with, like, the Kansas City Ron Paul campaign, and I did some robo calling and calling numbers and asking people to vote for Ron Paul. And so, but, the Ron Paul Giuliani moment, it was like, wow, this is like really big. And, I thought very seriously that this idea that, what the U.S. does, the blowback thing, that kind of caught my attention considering that Ron Paul had pushed that. And so, I supported Ron Paul in 2008. Then there was a rather, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, unfortunate period of my life, but something that, like, honestly, if I didn't have this experience, it would not make, I wouldn't be the person I am. But I got stuck in, I was selling or trying to sell and failing miserably, just losing a lot of money, selling Amway for 4 years. And, Amway with the very, Amway being the Voss Council for National Policy kingpins, that whole family, the Voss Van Andel syndicate. There's a very, very big time Christian conservative leaning to that. So for about 4 years, I'm kind of stuck in that bubble a little bit. You don't really think critically about, like, deep politics when you're in that kind of bubble. You believe you're saving the country from the evil socialists. So, I was there for about 4 years, but I was still into Ron Paul, and I campaigned again for Ron Paul in 2012. I was an alternate delegate at the Republican Missouri State Convention. And then I remember, I think the moment that really set me off on my current path was seeing Rand Paul endorse Mitt Romney, and just how much that broke my heart at the time. Like, it was just so extremely disappointing. And so from there, I started to go in a little bit of a different direction politically. Like, I was just starting to question everything, and it's very interesting. I think my first true experience with, like, the idea of September 11th as a conspiracy theory came from it came from starting to watch Abby Martin's show on RT. And so when I think about, like, my history with, like, Abby Martin and the Martin family and some of the events that unfolded there, why I was so passionate about that, it goes down to this being a primary influence in my evolution from, like, this libertarian minded, snapping out of this, like, Amway Christian conservative kind of brainwashing mindset into this more, maybe more you might call it conspiratorial line of thinking, came from her show, and this woman on this Russian state propaganda network being, like, the only person in media who will ask serious questions about September 11th attacks. And so from there, I don't have an exact timeline of, like, my evolution in terms of coming more and more closer and closer to understanding September 11th, but I also knew that, like, and thankfully, I never got caught up too much into the InfoWars We Are Change sphere. I think I missed the peak of that whole aspect of the September 11th movement. I'm sure you could talk about. I'm sure you could attest to this, Jeremy. I think I missed the peak of that by a few years, because I think the peak of that was kind of the 2006, 2007, 2008 time period. So I missed that. So thankfully, I kind of missed that peak of that whole thing. But I mean, I was somebody who I think I inherently understood that, like, you have all of these people questioning this and you have all of these anomalies. Like, you know, I think I was perceptive enough to understand and realize that, like, you don't have all of these professionals questioning and raising serious doubts about this official story, that it was touted and promoted and upheld by this media that I already knew was, one of the things you learn from, like, Ron Paul and from questioning the wars that take place and questioning, you know, your economic system through the big Ron Paul types of, platforms and talking points being foreign policy and economics, you come to realize already, you know, your media is not really for the people, and it's not an honest purveyor of the facts and information that the people need to know. So I think I was kind of inherently had this understanding that if you have all these people who are questioning this conventional wisdom, that there's something to it. So I continued to, over time, as I said, I don't have a timetable on this, grow and become more and more questionable of this narrative. And then over time, I started going to some meetings held by a dentist in the Kansas City area who, a mutual acquaintance of ours who was very, very big in terms of, September 11th and getting to the bottom of the truth about September 11th. And I saw a lot of videos, I took in a lot of material there that I think helped increase my understanding of a lot of aspects of the event itself and the impending and ongoing cover-up. And unlike you, Jeremy, I was not a heavy reader in terms of, like, reading, like, mountains of evidence for September 11th and then mountains of evidence in terms of debunkers. But what I could figure out was something I've been very good at, and you've given me credit for this before. I think this is one of my strongest points, is identifying propaganda networks and how, like, propaganda flows in terms of whether it's news media or in terms of any type of, networks, and connecting names and interests to, connecting names and connecting organizations to, paymasters or benefactors or whatever interest they might have. And I began to notice a pattern between, like, the cover-up in a couple of ways. Like, the cover-up of what I knew, like, there was this lie and that there were these serious scientific anomalies combined with facts and details about people within positions of government and influence who were never even held accountable for basic things. And I began to put together from, like, the quote right to the quote left. You have these media operations and these activism circles that are in place that are all seeming to not be forthright about what you knew would happen, much less the questions you still had. And so for me, it was a lot of connecting dots and seeing that the big media operations in place, and even alternative media. There's a lot of funding. There's a lot of shoestrings attached. To these various operations that keep them from going in certain directions and questioning certain things. And obviously, an event like September 11th, with my increased understanding of this, was a key pinpoint of, like, epicenter of an event that, like, all of these mutual and even seeing somebody like Abby Martin over time, like, gradually go backwards on September 11th after, like, this this kind of smear campaign that was put on her after she spoke out about Russia and Crimea on her RT show. These kind of things, like, just over time you see more and more of this, and you come to realize that there's a huge cover-up taking place, and that and even the Saudi Arabia factor, seeing early on, I think I'd identified this by the time we did our first recording, was the obsession with Saudi Arabia and how that's used as, like, this boogeyman every 3 or 4 years to throw out there to but what it covers for is both the operation. You still have, the plausible deniability. It was bad intelligence and we didn't identify with this foreign country, the letdowns of our intelligence. And it belies from the actual nature of the operation took place, which is not a let it happen on purpose or a, let it happen by accident, or however you want to put it. So I think for me, like, my strong point over time was understanding these questions and anomalies that are at place and being able to identify, like, networks and operations that were not, for whatever reason, able to give, like, facts and information on this topic, and then understanding and seeing how they go back in a lot of ways to the players involved in this operation, and then even becoming understanding of the 11/9 operation and the gradual continuum from, the events of September 11th to the events of 2016 to the events of now. You see the network and you see the operations at play and from a domestic perspective and from an international perspective. And so that's been my growth on this. It's been gradual, and it's been just something that I think over time I've been able to put more and more pieces together based on just identifying like networks and outlets and operations and how they cover or do not cover this critical issue and everything that's happened since then. And I would concur with your point, Jeremy, that like since we've started this program, much like you, I've had my eyes open in so many different ways, and we just continue to grow and learn. I think every day we're learning something new. So it's so for me, I haven't been in it quite as long as you, but it's been a gradual over time increasing of understanding, and you're still doing that to this day. We'll never have all the facts, but what best we can do is just learn as much as we can and just try to be as honest as we can about what we see going on. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Greg. And just two quick things that I came up when you were talking about your background in relationship to this, especially, was one thing is that in contrast to like all of the military recruiters, at your Kansas City, Missouri area high school, when at the time, when I graduated from Williams College. By the way, this is what's his name? Helms. This is where Helms went to school.
Richard Helms.
Richard Helms, and this is also where the Rockefellers had a summer home right off, sort of a mile off a campus somewhere, and it's where the Shah of Iran actually, I think, was brought after he was taken out in the Iranian Revolution, was brought to the Berkshires there. And so I saw, some the recruiters that were at our, that were in my sphere were the Bain Capitals, were the Goldman Sachs, and were probably the CIA was probably there too. I don't quite remember an exact time that they were recruiting, but I think they probably were recruiting on campus, so it would have been Wall Street and the intelligence community, that I could have gotten wrapped up. But it's also interesting the sort of the way that the Midwest, is marketed in that way, in terms of the high schoolers in Kansas City and stuff like that, then versus the liberal arts college graduates, and yet we both could have gotten wrapped up into, the post 9/11 operations, very likely on the wrong side of things in many ways, in terms of being Americans and where we really needed to be in terms of our patriotic duties, if we would put it at that. And so I guess where we meet here is with the Antedote, Greg, and I want to give you thanks both as my companion and as my friend in terms of the work that we do together and the unfolding process and the dialogical process of the growth of our understanding, and just may that we figure out how to continue to deepen that while also increasing its applications for real world and political positive payoff.
I absolutely concur with that, and likewise, thank you.
All right. Oh, one other thing that I forgot was that I believe that I actually flew back. I think my plane flight to fly back to the East Coast, I believe it was a flight back probably to Albany Airport from LAX, I think it was like one of the first days that the airport opened up. And so I remember going back to the airport, and I remember, there was someone left a bag somewhere, and it was so tense. And I remember at that time feeling like, oh boy, things have really changed. And yet I had a sense that like there was a theatrical aspect underneath all of that. All right, Greg, thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And we will, recording again soon. There's some interesting dynamics that are at play with current events that we want to go back to. So we'll be back very soon.
All right, Antedote, we out.